The ring of laughter echoed through Caleb Harrison's forge like unwelcome thunder. Outside, 3 members of the Red Valley Riders circled his century-old blacksmith shop, their motorcycles kicking up dust in the Montana twilight. They thought they'd found an easy mark, just another stubborn old man refusing to sell his land. What they didn't know was that those weathered hands steadily working the bellows hadn't always shaped metal. Those same hands had once guided some of the most precise long-range shots in military history, earning senior scout sniper Harrison a reputation that made hardened combat veterans speak his name in whispers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Red Valley Riders had spent months pressuring local businesses into selling their properties along the historic mining route, transforming the once peaceful valley into their own private empire. They'd never failed to get what they wanted, never encountered resistance they couldn't break. That was about to change. Let's take a quick break and tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories of justice served, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. The late September sun cast long shadows through the forge's weathered windows as Caleb worked, his movements deliberate and precise. The familiar scent of coal and hot steel filled the air, mixing with the crisp mountain breeze. At 72, his hands remained as steady as they'd been decades ago in the Hindu Kush Mountains, when he could thread a needle at 1,000 yards. The mechanical rhythm of his hammer-striking anvil masked the sound of his keen ears tracking every movement outside. Old Timer ought to have sold when he had the chance, a gravelly voice carried through the open door. Caleb continued his work, noting their positions through the subtle shifts in sound. 3 bikes, 6 boots on gravel, the telltale clink of concealed weapons. His own rifle waited within arm's reach, disguised among the tools of his trade. 20 years of running this forge had taught him to hide things in plain sight, just as his military training had taught him the value of appearing harmless. The bell above the door chimed as heavy boots crossed his threshold. Motorcycle leather creaked as 3 men entered, their patches identifying them as senior members of the Red Valley Riders. Behind them, through the forge's windows, Caleb spotted 2 more bikes arriving, standard intimidation formation, just like the insurgents used to run in Kandahar. Some things never changed, whether in war zones or small Montana towns. Mr. Harrison, the leader, stepped forward, a tall man with silver threading his beard and cold eyes that had seen their share of violence. His patch identified him as Sawback, James Miller, former infantry, dishonorable discharge. Caleb had done his research when the riders first appeared in the valley. Beautiful piece of history you've got here. Caleb set down his hammer, wiping his hands on his leather apron. To anyone watching, he looked like a tired old craftsman accepting the inevitable. They couldn't see how his mind was already calculating distances, angles, mapping fields of fire, just as he'd done in combat. "Can I help you, gentlemen, with something?" "Don't usually get many visitors this late." Sawback moved closer, running a finger along the edge of Caleb's workbench. His other hand stayed near his jacket, where the outline of a weapon was barely visible. "Times are changing, old timer. Valley's growing. Smart business owners understand the need to adapt, to sell to the right buyers." Through the windows, Caleb watched more bikes arrive. 8 total now, standard show of force. They thought numbers brought power. He'd learned long ago that precision mattered more than quantity. His fingers traced the hammer's worn handle, muscle memory from years of metalwork mixing with older, deadlier skills. "My family's worked this forge for 3 generations. Caleb kept his voice mild, letting them hear age and weariness rather than the steel underneath. "Not much interested in selling." "Wasn't exactly a request." One of the other riders stepped forward, younger, eager, his patch red knife. "Properties all up and down the valley are being sold. some willingly, some after. Unfortunate accidents. Caleb nodded slowly, as if considering their words. In reality, he was noting their positions, their stances, the subtle tells that telegraphed their training or lack thereof. 3 had military experience. The rest were just thugs with motorcycles. Important information for what was coming. Might need some time to think it over, he said, watching how they relaxed slightly at what they perceived as weakness. Another lesson from his sniper days. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they're in control. Sawback smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Take all the time you need, until tomorrow. After that, well, old buildings like this, they can be dangerous. Electrical problems, structure issues. Would be a shame if something happened while you were working late. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Through his windows, Caleb could see more riders positioning themselves around his property. They thought they were establishing dominance. Instead, they were showing him exactly where they'd be when he needed to find them. You know what's interesting about blacksmithing? Caleb asked conversationally, his weathered hands steady on his tools. Teaches you about precision, about patience, about waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. The words carried a weight they couldn't yet understand, just as they couldn't see how every tool in his forge could become a weapon, how every shadow held a prepared position, how every angle had been calculated long before they arrived. Because the Red Valley riders had made a critical mistake. They thought they were intimidating a simple old craftsman. Instead, they'd just threatened someone who had spent decades learning the art of turning threats into targets. Morning light spilled through the forge's old windows, catching dust motes that danced like golden sparks. Caleb Harrison had already been at work for hours, the rhythm of hammer on anvil as natural as breathing. The piece taking shape beneath his hands was a decorative gate hinge, commissioned by Sarah Chen, who ran the local historical society. In a changing valley, she fought to preserve its heritage, just as Caleb preserved the dying art of traditional blacksmithing. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," a young voice called out. Tommy Martinez, 13, and already showing remarkable talent with metalwork, appeared in the doorway. The boy had started hanging around the forge last summer, fascinated by the ancient craft. Now he came by most mornings before school, eager to learn. "Right on time?" Caleb nodded approvingly, hiding a smile. The boy reminded him of another eager student, long ago in Afghanistan, a young spotter who'd become one of the best in the unit. "Ready to check yesterday's project?" Tommy rushed to the cooling rack, where his first real piece waited, a simple hook, but one he'd made entirely himself. Caleb watched the boy examine it critically, noting flaws and strengths, just as he'd been taught. Some found it strange that an old blacksmith would take such interest in teaching a young boy, but Caleb believed in passing on knowledge. Skills, once lost, were hard to recover. He'd seen that truth in war and peace alike. "The strike marks are uneven," Tommy frowned, running his finger along the metal, "and the curve isn't quite symmetrical." "Good eye," Caleb approved. The boy was learning to see like a craftsman, to spot imperfections, to understand how small details affected the whole. Another lesson that applied beyond the forge. What would you do differently next time? Before Tommy could answer, the familiar rumble of Marcus Chen's delivery truck announced their regular morning visitor. Sarah's husband handled supply runs for most businesses in the valley, and his arrival usually brought news along with packages. "Morning, Caleb," Marcus called out, carrying a box of coal. His usually cheerful face was drawn with worry. "Tommy, how about you head to school early? I need to talk business with Mr. Harrison." Tommy looked disappointed but didn't argue. The boy was observant enough to read the tension in Marcus's voice. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Harrison. Thanks for checking my work." After Tommy left, Marcus set down the coal and glanced around nervously. Heard about the riders' visit last night. Mary at the diner saw them surrounding your place. Caleb continued working, his hammer strikes precise and measured. News travels fast. They hit Jenkins' place over in Cedar Grove last week. Marcus lowered his voice. His smithy's been there 60 years. Fire marshal called it electrical. But everyone knows better. Jenkins signed the sale papers yesterday. Price wasn't even half what the property's worth. Through the windows, Caleb watched Tommy walking to school, the boy's backpack bouncing with each step. He thought of other young lives he'd watched from a distance, through a scope's crosshairs, making decisions that would ripple through generations. Valley's changing, Marcus continued, arranging supplies with nervous energy. First, it was just property purchases, legal-like. Then the pressure started. Now we're hearing about connections in the state capital, politicians looking the other way. The riders aren't just thugs anymore. They're building something bigger. Caleb set down his hammer, studying the hinge he'd been crafting. Every curve, every joint had to be perfect, just like a clean shot. No room for error in either craft. How many businesses have they taken? 6 in the last month. They're moving systematically, targeting historic properties along the old mining route. Word is they're building some kind of private resort network. Exclusive places for people who want to disappear for a while. Your forge sits right at the crossroads of their planned development. The tactical implications were clear. Caleb had spent too many years reading terrain, understanding how geography shaped strategy, to miss the pattern. The riders weren't just buying property, they were securing strategic positions, creating a controlled corridor through the valley. Sarah's worried, Marcus added softly. Historical society's been fighting to preserve these old buildings, but they can't stop private sales, and after what happened to Jenkins, Caleb moved to his workbench, ostensibly checking orders, but actually confirming the positions of various tools and weapons he'd carefully placed. Tell Sarah to focus on documentation for now. Records, photographs, anything that proves the historical value of these properties. Marcus blinked at the specific instruction. You sound like you've handled similar situations. In another life, Caleb replied carefully, I learned that the right documentation can be more powerful than direct confrontation. Sometimes the best way to stop something is to make sure everyone can see it clearly. The morning sun climbed higher, sending sharp-edged shadows across the forge floor. They reminded Caleb of other shadows, other times when light and darkness had meant the difference between life and death. He'd chosen this peaceful life, this ancient craft, hoping to leave those skills behind. But some talents, once learned, couldn't be forgotten. Be careful, Caleb, Marcus said as he turned to leave. These people, they're not just criminals anymore. They've got real power now, connections. Even the sheriff looks the other way. Caleb nodded, returning to his work. The steady rhythm of hammer on anvil filled the forge once more, but his mind was already mapping out something very different from hinges and gates, because Marcus was right. The valley was changing, and sometimes, to protect what matters, old soldiers had to remember their original craft. Through his windows, he watched more motorcycles pass on the distant road, their riders scanning properties with calculating eyes. They thought they saw an old man's weakness. Soon they would learn about a different kind of strength, one forged not in fire, but in the patient precision of a man who had spent his life learning to change the course of events with a single, perfectly placed shot. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first real signs of trouble arrived 3 days later, carried on the autumn wind like smoke from a distant fire. Caleb was teaching Tommy the intricacies of tempering steel when Robert Walsh burst into the forge, his face ashen despite the morning chill. The old rancher had run the supply store 2 valleys over for nearly 40 years, a steady presence in an increasingly uncertain region. They burned it, Caleb. Robert's hands shook as he accepted the coffee Caleb offered. Middle of the night. My whole store, everything my father built. Fire marshals calling it faulty wiring. But I know what I saw. 3 bikes, running dark, just before the flames started. Caleb continued his demonstration for Tommy, his movements precise and controlled, while his mind processed the tactical implications. Take that steel out now, son. Remember, timing is everything with tempering. Too soon or too late, and the metal becomes unreliable. Tommy carefully removed the glowing metal, but his young eyes kept darting between the 2 older men, sensing the tension beneath their measured words. The boy was learning more than just metalwork in the forge. He was learning to read situations, to understand the weight of unspoken things. The riders offered to buy me out last week, Robert continued, his voice low. Said the valley was changing. That smart businessman knew when to adapt. When I refused, their lawyers showed up with papers claiming code violations, insurance problems, permit issues I'd never heard of. Caleb nodded slowly, recognizing the pattern. It matched reports he'd gathered from other valleys, other towns where the Red Valley Riders had expanded their influence. They're escalating their timeline, moving faster than they did in Cedar, Grove or Miller's Pass. You've been tracking them. Robert's eyes narrowed. In the background, Tommy worked his metal with focused concentration, but his slight head tilt betrayed his attention to the conversation. Information is like metal, Caleb replied, checking Tommy's work. Gather it carefully, shape it properly, and it becomes a powerful tool. The riders follow patterns, just like everything else in nature. The forge's warmth couldn't chase the chill from Robert's voice. Patterns clear enough, first come the offers, reasonable on the surface. Then the legal pressure, the mysterious problems. Finally, accidents, fires, structural failures, things that insurance companies can explain away, while honest folks lose everything. Caleb moved to his workbench, ostensibly checking orders, but actually confirming the positions of various implements he'd carefully placed. Each tool, each weapon, had its purpose and place, just like the elements of a well-planned operation. Tommy, time to head to school. Remember what we discussed about observing details? The boy nodded, understanding the dismissal. As he gathered his things, Caleb noted how Tommy's eyes swept the forge systematically, taking in positions and details just as he'd been taught. The boy was learning more than craftsmanship. He was learning awareness. After Tommy left, Robert leaned closer. Sheriff's not even pretending to investigate anymore. Got himself a new motorcycle last week, top of the line. His deputies all drive new trucks too. Law enforcement's compromised, Caleb stated flatly, remembering similar patterns in war zones where local authorities chose survival over duty. What about state police? Won't come near the valley unless they have to. Riders have friends in the capital now, people with influence. This isn't just about property anymore, Caleb. They're building something bigger, something that needs our valley's isolation and all these historic properties as cover. Through his windows, Caleb watched more motorcycles pass on the distant road. Their formation was too precise to be casual riders. They moved with military discipline, maintaining clear sight lines and communication distances. I recognized former service members among them, men who'd traded one uniform for another. They're coming for your forge next, Robert warned. Everyone knows it. Crossroads location, historical significance, direct access to 3 valley routes. It's perfect for whatever they're planning. Caleb's hands moved steadily over his work, muscle memory from years of practice allowing him to maintain his craft, while his mind worked on darker calculations. When did they first approach you about selling? 3 weeks ago, gave me 5 days to decide. By day 3, my suppliers started having delivery problems. By day 5, bank called about irregularities. In my business loan last night, Robert's voice trailed off, the memory of flames reflecting in his eyes. "They're getting more efficient," Caleb noted, recognizing the compressed timeline. In other valleys, they'd taken months to establish control. Here, they were moving faster, more aggressively, which meant they were either desperate or confident, both dangerous conditions in an opponent. The morning sun cast long shadows through the forge's windows, creating patterns that reminded Caleb of other times, other places where shadows had been both ally and enemy. He'd chosen this peaceful life, this ancient craft, hoping to leave certain skills behind. But as he watched more motorcycles pass, their riders scanning properties with predatory intent, he knew some talents couldn't be forgotten. "What are you going to do?" Robert asked quietly, reading something in Caleb's steady movements that others might miss. Caleb tested the edge of a newly forged blade, its balance perfect, its edge keen. "What I've always done, Robert. Wait for the right moment, maintain a steady hand, and remember that the most important targets aren't always the most obvious ones." Because the Red Valley Riders had made a fundamental mistake in their calculations. They saw an old man's forge and thought they understood its value. They never considered that some weapons are forged not in fire, but in the patient precision of a man who had spent his life learning to change the course of events with a single, perfectly placed shot. The confrontation Caleb had been expecting arrived at dusk, when shadows grew long, and the forge's fire painted everything in shades of amber and steel. He'd just finished his day's work, the rhythmic ping of cooling metal providing a counterpoint to the approaching rumble of motorcycles. Through his windows, he counted them. 12 bikes, moving in tactical formation, their riders maintaining professional spacing that spoke of military training. Sawback led them, his bike a custom machine that gleamed with menacing chrome. Behind him rode his core team, Knife, Storm, and Ghost, each chosen for specific skills that had nothing to do with riding motorcycles. The rest formed a perimeter, blocking potential escape routes with practiced efficiency. Caleb noted their positions while seemingly focused on cleaning his tools, his movements unhurried despite the growing tension. "Quite a show of force," he commented mildly as Sawback entered the forge, flanked by Knife and Storm. "Must be important business to bring so many visitors at closing time." Sawback's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Important business deserves proper attention, Mr. Harrison. We're here to discuss the future of your historic establishment." The way he said historic carried clear contempt. Through the windows, Caleb watched the remaining riders secure the perimeter. Their movements were too precise for common criminals. These were men who understood tactical positioning, who knew how to control terrain. In another life, he might have admired their proficiency. "Future seems pretty well established," Caleb replied, carefully arranging his hammers. Each tool was placed with deliberate precision, their positions measured in his mind just as he'd once measured distances through a scope. "Forge has been here 3 generations, plan to keep it that way." Storm moved to examine the walls, his fingers trailing over the aged wood. "Structure this old, lot of things could go wrong. Electrical, systems, support beams, foundation issues. Tragic how many historic buildings suffer accidents these days." Caleb noted how Storm's hand lingered near what appeared to be load-bearing posts. The man had demolitions training. It showed in the way he assessed structural weaknesses. Another piece of information filed away for later use. "Amazing what proper maintenance can prevent," Caleb responded, his voice steady as he moved to his workbench. The motion appeared casual, but gave him clear lines of sight to all 3 men. "Been maintaining this forge longer than most of you've been riding." Sawback's facade of friendliness cracked slightly. "Times change, old man. Valley's changing. Smart businessmen know when to adapt, when to take a generous offer before circumstances become unfortunate." Through the forge's windows, Caleb spotted movement on the ridge behind his property. Two more riders, positioned as overwatch. Their placement was professional, giving them clear fields of fire if they'd brought rifles. Filed that detail away too, adding it to his growing tactical assessment. Speaking of circumstances, Knife stepped forward, eager and aggressive. Heard about Walsh's store. Real shame. Insurance investigators say it might have been preventable with proper maintenance. Same thing could happen anywhere. Caleb's hands remained steady on his tools, but his mind was already calculating. Knife was the weak link. Too eager, too undisciplined. In combat, men like that were always the first to make mistakes. Maintenance is important, he agreed mildly. Like keeping your sight picture clear, maintaining proper breath control. The words were casual, but something in them made Sorbak's eyes narrow. The former infantry officer recognized the language of marksmen, of men who understood the art, of patient violence. You've got interesting ways of phrasing things, Mr. Harrison, almost like you've had specialized training. Blacksmithing requires precision, Caleb replied, letting them hear age in his voice while his eyes marked their positions with sniper's accuracy. Focus, patience, understanding that every action has consequences. Sorbak moved closer, his stance shifting subtly to fighting readiness. Consequences are exactly what we're here to discuss. Valley's changing whether you like it or not. By this time tomorrow, you either sign our very generous offer or we demonstrate why resisting progress is unwise. The threat hung in the air like forge smoke. Through his windows, Caleb watched the sun setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The light caught his arranged tools, making them gleam like the weapons they could become. Interesting thing about change, Caleb said quietly, his weathered hands steady on his workbench. Sometimes it doesn't go the way you expect. Sometimes the target you think is easy turns out to be something else entirely. Is that a threat, old man? Knife's hand moved toward his jacket, where metal glinted dully. Just an observation. Caleb smiled slightly, the expression reminiscent of crosshairs settling on center mass. From someone who spent a lifetime understanding how small actions can have very large consequences. Sorbak studied him with new intensity, finally seeing something beyond the aging craftsman. His next words carried careful precision. You're more than just a blacksmith. Everyone's more than they appear, Caleb agreed, his fingers tracing patterns on his workbench that matched the firing solutions already calculated in his mind. Question is, are you prepared to discover exactly how much more? The tension in the forge could have been cut with one of Caleb's freshly forged knives. Through his windows, he watched the Overwatch team shift positions, responding to some signal. They were good, professional, but he'd been better, in places where good meant living and professional meant making impossible shots count. 24 hours, Sorbak said finally, his voice hard. After that, we show you exactly how much the valley has changed. As they mounted their bikes and roared away, Caleb remained at his workbench, his movements deliberate as he checked his tools and weapons one final time. Because the Red Valley Riders had made another crucial mistake. They thought they were threatening a simple craftsman. Instead, they just challenged someone who understood that the deadliest weapon isn't always the most obvious one. Dawn painted the mountains in shades of steel gray as Marcus Chen's delivery truck pulled behind Caleb's forge, followed by Robert Walsh's weathered pickup. They weren't alone. Sarah Chen from the Historical Society, Deputy Rachel Martinez, and James Cooper from the hunting supply store emerged from their vehicles, moving with the quiet purpose of people who understood the gravity of their gathering. They're watching the main road, Deputy Martinez reported, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. Two bikes, trying to look casual, another team monitoring the highway intersection. Her voice carried the precision of someone who'd spent time in law enforcement, but her eyes held the wariness of an officer who'd discovered her department could no longer be trusted. Caleb nodded, leading them through the forge's back entrance. He'd arranged his workspace differently overnight, creating clear lines of sight to all approaches while positioning tools and weapons within easy reach. The changes were subtle, professional. Only someone with combat experience would recognize how the simple workshop had been transformed into a defensive position. Found these in the Historical Society archives. Sarah spread photographs across Caleb's workbench. Every property the riders have targeted, every business they've pressured. There's a pattern here, something bigger than just taking over local establishments. Caleb studied the images with a sniper's attention to detail. The properties formed a strategic corridor through the valley, each location offering specific advantages, clear views, multiple access routes, defensive positions. They're not just buying real estate, they're securing a supply line. For what? Marcus asked, but his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Gun running would be my guess, James Cooper spoke up. The hunting store owner's careful movements marked him as former military, though he rarely spoke of his service. Valley's perfect for it. Remote, multiple escape routes, legitimate businesses as cover. Historic properties are ideal. Thick walls, established loading areas, reasonable excuses for heavy traffic. Sarah's hands tightened on her papers. That's why they're moving so fast now. They're not just building a criminal operation, they're establishing infrastructure. Caleb moved to his forge, stoking the fire with practiced efficiency. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, reminiscent of other fires in other places where he'd planned operations. Tell me about their pattern of acquisition, everything you've observed. The group shared details, building a comprehensive picture of the riders' methodology. Deputy Martinez described changed patrol routes and compromised officers. Marcus outlined disrupted supply lines and strategic pressure points. Sarah detailed the legal mechanisms used to force sales. Each piece added to the tactical assessment Caleb was forming. They're professional, Cooper noted, examining one of Caleb's carefully positioned tools. His eyes recognized the defensive preparations for what they were. Military training in their leadership. This isn't just a gang taking territory. No, Caleb agreed, his weathered hands steady as he selected a piece of steel for forging. This is a military operation disguised as criminal enterprise. They're using gang tactics as cover for something more organized. What can we do? Robert asked, the memory of his burned store reflecting in his eyes. They've got the law, the money, the manpower. Caleb's hammer struck metal with precise force, the sound sharp in the morning air. They have resources. We have knowledge, local terrain, community connections, detailed understanding of the valley. In combat, information often matters more than numbers. Deputy Martinez straightened slightly, recognizing the tactical assessment. You're talking about resistance, organized opposition. I'm talking about protecting what's ours. Caleb corrected, though his tone carried the weight of combat experience. But it has to be done right, strategic, professional. Through his windows, he spotted Tommy arriving for his morning lesson. The boy moved with the careful awareness Caleb had taught him, noting the vehicles hidden behind the forge. Even young eyes could be trained to see what others missed. We'll need a network, Caleb continued, working the steel with focused precision. Eyes everywhere, communications secure, positions prepared. Sarah, your historical documentation gives us coverage, legitimate reason to photograph and record everything happening in the valley. I can coordinate with other business owners. Marcus added, create a warning system, share intelligence about rider movements. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. My customers know these mountains better than anyone. They can watch the back routes, track unusual activity. And I still have contacts in state law enforcement, Deputy Martinez offered. Ones I trust, outside the rider's influence. Caleb examined his work, testing the steel's strength, just as he was testing the strength of this forming alliance. They expect individuals acting alone, easy targets they can isolate and pressure. Instead, they'll face an organized response. But it has to be coordinated, professional. One mistake, and they'll burn everything we're trying to protect. Sarah studied him with new understanding. You've done this before, in another life, in another war, Caleb agreed quietly, his hands never pausing in their work. Different terrain, different enemy, same principles. Control the information, prepare the battlefield, wait for the right moment to act. Through his forge windows, he watched more motorcycles pass on the distant road. The riders were increasing their surveillance, confident in their power. They thought they were watching an old man's last hours of resistance. Instead, they were witnessing the first stages of a counter-operation planned by someone who had spent decades learning how to turn hunters into targets. It won't be easy, Cooper warned, recognizing the scope of what they were undertaking. No, Caleb agreed, his hammer strikes precise and measured. But neither was teaching a rifle to reach out past 1,000 yards. Some things are worth the effort of perfecting. Because the Red Valley Riders had made another crucial miscalculation. They thought they were facing isolated individuals. Instead, they were about to encounter a coordinated resistance led by someone who understood that the most effective weapon isn't always the most visible one. Sometimes it's the quiet precision of a community united under the guidance of a warrior who had never forgotten his deadliest skills. The first test of Caleb's network came sooner than expected. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Marcus Chen's delivery truck rolled to a stop behind the forge. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by urgent purpose as he burst through the back door. "They're moving on Cooper's hunting supply store," Marcus reported, his breath coming in controlled bursts. 3 bikes just pulled up, Sawbacks leading them personally. Caleb continued working at his forge, his movements deliberate and precise. Through the windows, he noted 2 more motorcycles passing on the main road, maintaining their surveillance. Pattern. Sarah's in position. Historical societies documenting everything. She's got 3 different angles on Cooper's store, all perfectly legal since it's a registered historic building. Marcus moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Deputy Martinez has her trusted officers watching the back approaches. Caleb nodded, his weathered hands steady as they shaped glowing steel. The metal's bright orange reminded him of tracer rounds in the dark, of other times when patience and precision had meant the difference between victory and defeat. Cooper knows what to do. Following your instructions exactly. He's making them wait, playing the nervous shopkeeper. Robert's already spreading word about unusual inventory demands from the riders, seeds of doubt, just like you said. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb tracked movement patterns across the valley. The riders maintained professional discipline, but their focus on Cooper's store left gaps in their coverage, exactly as planned. They think they're running a standard intimidation operation, Caleb explained, quenching his work with practiced efficiency. The steam rose like signal smoke. Pressure the business, isolate the owner, force compliance through fear. But they're actually revealing their entire supply chain. Marcus watched another motorcycle pass, its rider scanning the area with military precision. How so? Watch their patterns, the businesses they target, the timing of their moves, the resources they commit. Every action exposes another piece of their infrastructure. Caleb moved to his workbench, checking the positions of tools that could become weapons at a moment's notice. Cooper's store isn't just a target, it's a key supply point for their operation. They need his inventory lists, his shipping manifests, his customer records. Right on cue, Sarah's voice came through the secure radio hidden among Caleb's tools. 3 more bikes approaching from the North Road. These ones are carrying cargo, computer equipment by the looks of it, getting it all on camera. They're creating documentation, Caleb explained to Marcus. Records that will show legitimate purchases, establish paper trails for their real operation. But they're also creating evidence. Deputy Martinez's voice joined the radio traffic. Got movement at the sheriff's office. 2 cruisers heading toward Cooper's. Standard response time for a business dispute, but they're taking the long route. Giving the riders time to secure what they need, Caleb noted. His hands moved steadily over his forge work, but his mind was mapping patterns of movement, calculating intersections and choke points just as he'd done in combat. Cooper will resist, just enough to make it believable, then appear to cave under pressure. They'll think they've won another victory. Marcus frowned. But if he gives in, he gives them exactly what we want them to have. Caleb's smile held the patient precision of a sniper selecting his moment. Every transaction recorded, every unusual request documented, every pattern of behavior caught on camera. Sarah's Historical Society documentation provides perfect cover for gathering intelligence. Through his windows, Caleb watched the scene unfold at Cooper's store. The riders maintained professional positions, their motorcycles arranged to control approaches and exits. They thought they were running a tactical operation. Instead, they were being recorded from multiple angles, their methods and movements, documented with military precision. "Listen," Caleb instructed quietly. Through the valley's clear air, they could hear Sawback's voice carrying from Cooper's store. The former infantry officer was outlining terms, inventory requirements, shipping schedules, customer record access. Each demand was another piece of evidence, another link in the chain they were forging around themselves. "Won't they suspect a trap?" Marcus asked, watching Cooper's performance through borrowed binoculars. "This seems almost too easy." "Best. Trap is one the target thinks they've avoided," Caleb replied, remembering lessons learned in combat. "They'll be suspicious at first, looking for obvious resistance. Finding none, they'll attribute their success to their own skill and power. Pride blinds better than sand in the eyes." Sarah's voice crackled through the radio again. "They're leaving Cooper's. 3 bikes headed north, 2 south, all carrying documentation. Got clear images of everything they took." "Now we wait," Caleb said, returning to his forge work. The steady rhythm of hammer on anvil filled the air, masking the sound of their operation's gears turning. They'll repeat this pattern at other businesses, thinking they're establishing control. Instead, they're giving us everything we need to expose their entire network. Because the Red Valley Riders had made another critical error in judgment. They thought they were conducting a sophisticated criminal operation. Instead, they were being systematically documented by someone who understood that the most effective weapon isn't always a gun or a blade. Sometimes it's the patient accumulation of evidence, guided by the steady hand of a warrior who had learned that the deadliest shots are the ones the target never sees coming. Through his forge windows, Caleb watched the sun setting behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of tactical opportunity. The riders thought they were tightening their grip on the community. They didn't realize they were actually helping to forge the weapons of their own destruction, one documented transaction at a time. The morning Tommy failed to appear for his usual lesson, Caleb knew something had changed. The boy's absence spoke louder than any threat, its silence carrying weight like a bullet before impact. Deputy Martinez confirmed his fears when she arrived minutes later, her uniform wrinkled from an all-night shift, her eyes carrying the burden of unwelcome news. They approached him yesterday after school, she reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. Caught him walking home along River Road. 2 riders, very professional, very careful not to seem threatening, just a friendly chat about his apprenticeship at the forge. Caleb's hands remained steady on his work, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle change that transformed the aging craftsman into something altogether more dangerous. "Tell me everything." They mentioned what a shame it would be if anything happened to interfere with his future. How accidents in workshops can have lasting consequences. How proper supervision is crucial for young apprentices. Martinez watched Caleb carefully, recognizing the controlled fury in his precise movements. "Tommy's mother called me right after. The boy told her everything, just like you taught him." Through his windows, Caleb tracked the usual motorcycle patrols, noting how they'd adjusted their patterns. The riders were watching more carefully now, expecting reaction to their latest move. They thought they were applying tactical pressure. Instead, they just made a fundamental mistake. "They're escalating," Marcus observed, entering through the back door. "Sarah says they've started questioning her historical society volunteers about your military background. They're digging deeper, trying to understand who they're really dealing with." Caleb moved to his workbench, checking the positions of various implements with sniper's precision. Each tool, each weapon, waited in its designated place, ready for the moment timing and circumstance would determine their true purpose. They're following standard psychological warfare protocol. When direct intimidation fails, target those close to the objective. Force emotional rather than tactical responses. "This isn't combat, Caleb," Martinez said quietly, but her hand unconsciously checked her sidearm. "These are our families they're threatening. Every fight becomes personal eventually," Caleb replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. "Question is whether you let that work for you or against you." The radio hidden among his tools crackled with Cooper's voice. "Got 2 of them watching the school now. Professional distance, maintaining cover as concerned citizens. They're good. Most people wouldn't notice them. But Tommy did," Caleb noted with grim pride. The boy had learned his lessons well, applying the awareness training that had seemed like simple observation games. He spotted their patterns, recognized the threat, reported accurately without raising suspicion. He's better prepared than they realize. Martinez's radio chirped with an official alert. "Sheriff's calling an emergency meeting. Says there's been complaints about unsafe conditions at your forge. Wants to discuss apprenticeship safety protocols. They're moving on multiple fronts," Marcus observed. "Legal pressure, personal threats, official interference. Very coordinated." Caleb's hammer struck steel with measured force, each blow precise and purposeful. The metal bent to his will, just as circumstances would bend to his planning. "They think targeting Tommy will make us emotional, force mistakes. Instead, they've given us exactly what we need." "How so?" Martinez asked, but her expression suggested she was beginning to understand. "Threatening businesses is criminal but complex. Lots of legal gray areas, corporate complications, but threatening children," Caleb's smile held no warmth. "That's clear-cut. Documented intimidation of a minor breaks through all their careful legal cover." Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb watched more motorcycles arrive at carefully measured intervals. The riders were maintaining tactical discipline, following their standard protocols. They thought they were tightening the noose. Instead, they were walking into carefully prepared positions. "Sarah's got cameras on every approach to the school now," Marcus reported. "All perfectly legal under historical documentation protocols. Every move they make near Tommy is being recorded." "And I've contacted trusted officers in the state police," Martinez added. "They're very interested in organized threats against minors. Gives them jurisdiction even if local law enforcement is compromised." Caleb checked his watch. with the same precision he'd once used to calculate shot timing. Tommy's smart. He'll follow the response protocols we practiced, maintaining routine while gathering intelligence. Every interaction becomes evidence. You prepared for this, Marcus realized. You've been training him all along, haven't you? Every student learns more than just their obvious craft, Caleb replied, remembering other students, other wars. Tommy's been learning awareness, observation, pattern recognition, skills that serve both metalwork and survival. The forges, he'd painted everything in shades of tactical opportunity as Caleb moved through his morning routine. Each action was measured, each position calculated, just as he'd once prepared firing solutions for impossible shots. "What's our next move?" Martinez asked, recognizing the shift in Caleb's demeanor from craftsman to strategist. "We let them think their plan is working," Caleb said quietly, his weathered hands steady on tools that could become weapons in an instant. "Let them believe targeting Tommy has given them leverage. Meanwhile, we document everything, build our case, and prepare for the moment they realize their critical mistake." "Which is?" Marcus prompted. "They thought threatening a child would give them control over an old man." Caleb's voice carried the deadly precision of a sniper selecting his target. "Instead, they've just given a former combat instructor reason to stop playing defense. Because the Red Valley Riders had made their most serious miscalculation, yet they thought threatening Tommy would weaken Caleb's resolve. Instead, they just awakened something far more dangerous than a simple blacksmith. They'd roused the protective instincts of a warrior who had spent his life learning that the deadliest force isn't anger or fear, but the cold precision of justified retribution. The confrontation ignited at dawn, when the valley's morning mist still clung to the ground like smoke after artillery fire. Caleb had been expecting it. The timing was tactically sound, matching patterns he'd observed in military operations across 3 continents. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, he watched the riders approach, 20 bikes moving in combat formation, their engines barely above idle to maintain sound discipline. Sawback led the main group, while additional riders secured elevated positions along the ridge lines. Their deployment was professional, demonstrating the kind of tactical awareness that had once impressed Caleb in other theaters of war. Now it simply confirmed his assessment of their capabilities and helped him refine his response. "They're moving on Cooper's store first." Deputy Martinez's voice came through the concealed radio, calm and measured. 8 bikes, standard intimidation. Formation. They're implementing simultaneous operations. "Sarah's teams are in position," Marcus added. "Every approach covered, every interaction documented. State police have been notified. They're holding position outside the valley, waiting for clear jurisdiction." Caleb continued working at his forge, his movements deliberate and precise. Each hammer strike marked time like a sniper's heartbeat. Between shots. "Cooper knows what to do. Let them think they're in control while we document everything. The real target isn't the immediate confrontation." Through his windows, he watched more riders establish containment positions around the valley's key points. They were good, maintaining professional discipline while executing their operation. But their very precision worked against them, making their patterns predictable to someone who had spent decades studying military movements. "They're at Cooper's now," Martinez reported. "Standard entry team, 4 men. Rest maintaining perimeter." "Wait, something's wrong. They're pulling back, regrouping. Cooper must have surprised them." Caleb allowed himself a small smile. The hunting store owner had followed instructions perfectly, presenting the riders with documentation they hadn't expected. Inventory records showing suspicious orders from their own people, shipping manifests highlighting irregular patterns, customer logs revealing their surveillance operations. "They're redirecting," Marcus observed through binoculars. 10 bikes heading toward the forge. Sawback looks unsettled. "Confusion disrupts tactical momentum," Caleb commented, remembering lessons learned in combat. "When prepared resistance, replaces expected submission. Standard protocols become liabilities rather than advantages. Gene. The approaching motorcycles maintained their professional formation, but Caleb noted subtle signs of uncertainty in their spacing and speed. Through his mirrors, he tracked their deployment around his forge while continuing his work with measured precision. Every tool, every weapon, waited in its designated place, ready for the moment timing and circumstance would transform their purpose. They're surrounding the forge, Martinez warned unnecessarily. Standard containment pattern, but they're staying back. Something's made them cautious. Knowledge is power, Caleb replied calmly, his weathered hands steady on his hammer. They're starting to realize they're not the only ones with military training, not the only ones who understand tactical operations. Sawback entered alone, his confident stride betraying tension to Caleb's trained eye. Two riders flanked the door, while others maintained perimeter positions. Professional, but revealing their growing uncertainty through subtle tells. The way they watched angles, checked sightlines, maintained distance. "Quite an operation you're running, Harrison." Sawback's voice carried forced casualness. "Coordinated resistance, documented evidence, tactical countermeasures. Not exactly standard blacksmith skills." Caleb continued working, his hammer strikes. Precise and measured, metalwork teaches valuable lessons. Patience, precision, understanding that every action leaves its mark. "Your friend Cooper was impressive." Sawback moved carefully through the forge, noting how every position offered Caleb clear lines of sight and multiple options. Very organized records he kept, almost like he was expecting to need them. "Good business practices," Caleb replied mildly, but his positioning shifted subtly, maintaining tactical advantage as Sawback moved. Documentation matters, especially when dealing with irregular activities. Through his mirrors, Caleb watched more riders arrive, establishing secondary containment positions. Their formation suggested they were preparing for resistance, but their patterns showed growing uncertainty. They had expected to find a simple craftsman. Instead, they were encountering coordinated opposition led by someone who understood their tactics intimately. This was supposed to be simple. Sawback's facade cracked slightly, revealing the frustrated officer beneath. Quick tactical operation, establish control, move on. Instead, we've got state police interested, evidence being gathered, organized resistance. Who are you really, Harrison? "Just a blacksmith." Caleb smiled slightly, the expression reminiscent of crosshairs settling on target. "Who happens to understand that the best way to stop a tactical operation is to make it visible, document its patterns, expose its weaknesses?" Martinez's voice came through his concealed radio. "State police moving in. They've got jurisdiction now, documented threats against minors, organized criminal activity across county lines. Local sheriff can't block them anymore." Sawback's radio crackled with urgent updates as his carefully planned operation began unraveling. Through the forge windows, Caleb watched riders responding to new threats, their disciplined formation, struggling to adapt as law enforcement approached from multiple directions. "You planned this," Sawback realized, his tactical mind finally recognizing the trap. "Every response, every position, every piece of evidence. We thought we were running an operation. Instead, we were being documented, our own patterns used against us." "Proper preparation prevents poor performance," Caleb quoted the old military maxim while his hands maintained their steady work. "You ran a professional operation, but you forgot the most important tactical principle, which is never assume you're the only one who knows how to fight a war." Caleb's voice carried the deadly precision of a sniper who had already calculated his shot. Sometimes the target you think is defenseless turns out to be better armed than you are, not with weapons, but with knowledge. Because the Red Valley riders had made their final tactical error. They thought they were executing a standard military operation against civilian targets. Instead, they'd walked into a carefully prepared counter-operation designed by someone who had spent his life learning that the most effective weapon isn't force or fear, but the patient precision of documented truth deployed at exactly the right moment. The valley echoed with the thunder of approaching motorcycles as dawn painted the mountains in shades of tactical warning. Through his forge windows, Caleb counted the reinforcements. 40 bikes moving in combat formation, their riders wearing patches from 3 different chapters. The Red Valley riders were escalating, bringing in experienced operators from other territories. "They've blocked the main roads," Deputy Martinez reported through the secure radio, her voice tight with professional concern. "Multiple teams, military-grade equipment. These aren't just gang members. I'm seeing former special operations, private military contractors." Caleb continued working at his forge, his movements deliberate as he processed the tactical implications. The hammer strikes masked the sound of him checking weapons positioned throughout the workshop. "They're changing protocols. No more pretense of legitimate business. This is a direct military operation now." Marcus's voice crackled through the radio. "Just got word from my contacts in Cedar Grove. Similar forces moving through other valleys. They're mobilizing everything they have, calling in favors from aligned organizations." Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb tracked the new arrivals' deployment patterns. Their formation spoke of extensive combat experience. Systematic coverage of approaches, overlapping fields of fire, elevated observation posts. They were preparing for serious resistance, which meant Sawback had finally recognized the true nature of his opposition. "Sarah's teams are still in position," Cooper reported. "Every movement documented, every new player identified. State police are asking for patience. They're mobilizing tactical units, but it'll take time to coordinate a valley-wide operation." "Time is what they're counting on," Caleb replied, his weathered hands steady as they shaped glowing steel. "Standard tactical escalation, overwhelming show of force, establish complete control, eliminate resistance before outside intervention arrives." The morning sun caught his arranged tools, making them gleam like the weapons they could become. Each implement waited in its designated place, positioned with the same precision he'd once used to set up sniper hides in other conflicts. "Multiple teams approaching the forge," Martinez warned. "Professional flanking maneuvers, combat spacing. They're not taking chances this time." Caleb watched through his mirrors as riders established containment positions. Their deployment was textbook perfect, demonstrating the kind of tactical proficiency that would have impressed him in another life. Now it simply confirmed his assessment of the escalating threat. "Cooper, status of the hunting store?" Caleb's voice remained calm, measured. "Secured and prepared, just like you planned. They think they've got us contained, but every approach is covered, every position documented. Sarah's people are using the Historical Society's aerial survey drones, completely legal for architectural documentation. The forge's heat painted everything in shades of tactical opportunity as Caleb moved through his morning routine. Each action was calculated, each position measured, just as he'd once prepared firing solutions for impossible shots. Sawback entered. First, flanked by 2 new operators whose bearing marked them as former special forces. Their patches identified them as senior members from other chapters, Ghost and Reaper, names that might have been melodramatic if not for the deadly competence evident in their movement. "Impressive response time," Caleb commented mildly, noting their positions with sniper's precision. "Must be important to bring in such professional reinforcements." "You've forced our hand, Harrison." Sawback's voice carried cold fury beneath its professional control. "We tried to handle this quietly, maintain legitimate coverage. Now we do it the hard way." Through his windows, Caleb watched more teams secure the perimeter. Their coordination was excellent, their tactical discipline obvious. They thought they were preparing for a decisive operation. Instead, they were walking into carefully prepared fields of fire. "Interesting choice," Caleb observed, his hands never pausing in their work. "Escalating to direct military action sacrifices your legitimate business cover. Hard to explain this kind of mobilization to corporate sponsors and political allies." "We're past explanations," Ghost stepped forward, his movement marking him as former Delta Force. "You've seen too much, documented too much. Time for decisive action." Caleb allowed himself a small smile, one that reminded Sawback of crosshairs settling on target. Decisive action requires clear intelligence, understanding the operational environment, knowing your opposition's capabilities. You're still fighting the last war. Thinking force and numbers guarantee victory. We've got over 60 operators in the valley." Reaper's voice carried the confidence of someone used to overwhelming opposition. "Every exit covered, every approach controlled. This ends today." "Numbers impressive," Caleb agreed, his weathered hands steady on tools that could become weapons in an instant. "But you're making a fundamental tactical error. You think you're launching an operation. Instead, you're walking into one that's been prepared since you first threatened this valley." Because the Red Valley Riders had made another crucial miscalculation. They thought bringing in professional reinforcements would guarantee victory. Instead, they just provided more witnesses, more documentation, more evidence of their true nature. And they were about to learn why some battles aren't won by the side with the most forces, but by the one with the most patience. The one who understands that true victory often comes not from the strength of your attack, but from the precision of your preparation. The revelation came from an unexpected source. As morning light filled the forge with sharp-edged shadows, a new motorcycle approached, this one riding alone, its engine note precise and controlled. Through his mirrors, Caleb recognized the riders. Military bearing before the man, even dismounted. Colonel James Morrison, former Special Operations Command, now working with military intelligence. His arrival changed everything. "Impressive operation you're running here, Master Sergeant Harrison," Morrison called out as he entered the forge. The use of Caleb's former rank sent a ripple through the assembled riders. Or should I say, Ghost Whisper? "That was your call sign in the Hindu Kush, wasn't it?" Sawback's expression shifted from confidence to sudden uncertainty. The name Ghost Whisper carried weight in certain circles, a legend among snipers known for impossible shots and perfect mission completion rates. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb watched the realization spread through the riders' ranks. "Been a long time, Colonel," Caleb replied, his weathered hands never pausing in their work. Each hammer strike now carried new meaning, the precision of a man who had once orchestrated operations that changed the course of conflicts. "Didn't expect to see you in this valley." Morrison moved through the forge with careful respect, noting how every position offered tactical advantages that most would miss. When reports started coming in about organized resistance to criminal operations in this region, complete with professional documentation and tactical precision, I got curious, started pulling files, making connections. Through the radio, Caleb heard his allies reacting to the revelation. Deputy Martinez's sharp intake of breath, Cooper's quiet whistle of understanding. They were finally seeing the full picture of the man who had been guiding their resistance. Ghost Whisper. Reaper spoke the name with a mix of awe and fear. 300 confirmed kills at extreme range. Wrote the book on counterinsurgency operations. They said you disappeared after that last mission in Kazakhstan. Didn't disappear, Caleb corrected, testing the edge of a newly forged blade. Just found a different way to serve. Some battles don't need rifles to be won. Morrison nodded, understanding filling his expression. You've been teaching them, haven't you? The whole community. Not just metalwork, but observation, tactical, awareness, coordinated response protocols. building a network that could resist organized criminal operations. Through his windows, Caleb watched the riders' formation subtly shift. Their professional confidence was cracking as they realized the true nature of their opposition. They hadn't been fighting a simple blacksmith. They'd been engaging with one of the most effective special operations veterans in military history. "Tell me something, Colonel." Caleb set down his hammer, finally giving Morrison his full attention. "Why are you really here? This isn't just about recognizing an old operator." "No," Morrison agreed, his voice carrying official weight. "It's about something bigger. These organized criminal operations you've been documenting, they're connected to international networks, terrorist financing, weapons trafficking. Your resistance here has exposed patterns we've been trying to track for years." Sorbach's composure cracked further. "You're saying this whole time, while we thought we were pressuring a local craftsman, you were actually providing evidence to a coordinated counter-terrorism operation," Morrison finished. "Every move documented, every connection exposed, every pattern revealed." Ghost Whisper always did prefer to let his targets walk into his shots willingly. The tension in the forge could have been cut with one of Caleb's blades. Through his radio, he heard Sarah confirming that everything was still being recorded. Every word documented for official use. The riders' reinforcements were now witnesses to their own organization's exposure. "Your choice now." Caleb addressed Sorbach directly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once guided special operations teams through impossible missions. "Continue escalating, add federal charges to your problems, or recognize when a position has become tactically untenable." Morrison moved to the forge window, carefully staying clear of Caleb's prepared fields of fire. "I've got 3 tactical teams on standby, plus state police ready to move, but I don't think we'll need them. Will we, Sergeant Harrison?" "Depends," Caleb replied, his weathered hands steady on tools that could become weapons in an instant. "Some people need to learn their lessons the hard way. Others recognize when they've been outmaneuvered by a superior tactical mind." Because the Red Valley Riders had made their most critical error yet. They thought bringing in professional reinforcements would guarantee victory. Instead, they just witnessed the revelation of their opponent's true identity. A legendary special operations veteran who had spent his life perfecting the art of letting targets walk willingly into carefully prepared positions. And now, they faced a choice: continue their doomed operation, or accept that they'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered by a master of strategic warfare who had turned their own tactics against them. Colonel Morrison's presence transformed the forge into an impromptu command center, where the scale of what Caleb had uncovered began to emerge. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb watched the riders' reinforcements maintaining their positions, but their professional confidence had been replaced by growing uncertainty as Morrison laid out the broader implications of their operation. "Your network exposed more than just local criminal activities," Morrison explained, spreading satellite images across Caleb's workbench. "These valleys form a corridor that connects 3 international borders, the historical properties you've been protecting. Perfect cover for a sophisticated weapons trafficking operation." Caleb continued his work at the forge, each hammer strike precise and measured as he processed the tactical implications. The motorcycle gangs were just the visible element, a screen to hide something bigger. "Much bigger," Morrison confirmed. "We've been tracking similar patterns across multiple states. Criminal organizations using motorcycle clubs as deniable assets, establishing control over strategic routes through seemingly legitimate business acquisitions. But we could never prove the connection until your documentation started revealing the patterns." Through his radio, Caleb heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath as she reviewed their gathered evidence with new understanding. The historical society photographs, They weren't just documenting buildings, they were mapping an entire smuggling network. Exactly, Morrison nodded. Every property the riders targeted sits at a strategic point along established trafficking routes. Local law enforcement compromised, business records altered, community resistance eliminated. Perfect infrastructure for moving illegal cargo across borders without detection. Sawback shifted uncomfortably, his former military training telling him exactly how thoroughly they'd been compromised. You're saying this whole time, while we thought we were running a sophisticated criminal operation, you were actually providing evidence of international weapons trafficking, Caleb finished, his weathered hands steady on his tools. Every move documented, every pattern exposed, every connection revealed. Sometimes the best way to understand a network is to watch how it tries to expand. Deputy Martinez's voice came through the radio, tight with professional concern. Got movement on the satellite feeds, multiple vehicles approaching the valley on unmarked roads. These aren't motorcycles, heavy transport, professional drivers, military-grade equipment. The real operators, Morrison confirmed grimly, the ones who usually stay hidden behind layers of legitimate business and criminal cover. Your resistance forced them to show themselves. Through his windows, Caleb watched the riders' reinforcements responding to new orders, their formation shifting to accommodate the approaching threat. They were professional, disciplined, but he could see the uncertainty in their movements as they realized they were caught between opposing forces. Your choice is getting simpler, Caleb addressed Sawback directly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once guided special operations teams through impossible situations. The people you really work for are coming, the ones who hide behind motorcycle gangs and legitimate businesses. Question is, do you want to be positioned with them when federal tactical teams arrive, or are you ready to reconsider your operational loyalties? Morrison moved to the forge window, carefully staying clear of Caleb's prepared fields of fire. We've got satellite coverage of the entire valley now. Every approach monitored, every vehicle tracked, plus evidence of international weapons trafficking, terrorist financing, and corruption at multiple levels of law enforcement. The motorcycle gangs are the least of anyone's concerns at this point. Cooper's voice crackled through the radio. Multiple helicopters approaching from the north. Looked like private military contractors, professional equipment, tactical formations. Blackwater veterans, Morrison identified them, hired by the same people who've been using motorcycle gangs as cover. They're coming to clean up loose. Hence, eliminate evidence, including any witnesses. The implications hung in the air like forge smoke. Through his mirrors, Caleb watched the riders processing this new information, realizing they were merely pawns in a much larger operation. Their professional discipline was cracking as they understood the true nature of the organization they served. Time to decide, Caleb said quietly, his hands never pausing in their work. The people you've been working for are coming to eliminate all traces of their operation, including expendable assets like motorcycle gangs who know too much. You can stand with them, face federal charges for international weapons trafficking, or you can make a different choice. Because the Red Valley Riders had just discovered their most devastating truth yet. They thought they were running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Instead, they'd been unwitting pawns in an international weapons trafficking operation, and their own bosses were coming to ensure their silence. Now they faced a choice: stand with the people who saw them as expendable assets, or align with the legendary special operations veteran who had exposed their organization not just to destroy it, but to offer its members a chance at redemption. The battlefield shifted from physical to digital as dawn painted the valley in shades of tactical opportunity. Caleb worked steadily at his forge, while Morrison coordinated with federal agencies through encrypted channels, their combined intelligence. Networks coming alive with urgent activity. Through his carefully positioned surveillance systems, Caleb watched the approaching forces while monitoring the flood of information flowing through their secured communications. "They're trying to erase their digital footprint," Sarah reported, through the encrypted radio, her voice tight with concentration. "Massive data deletion attempts across multiple servers, but every file they try to eliminate creates new evidence of deliberate destruction." Morrison nodded grimly, reviewing real-time updates on his secure tablet. "Classic counterintelligence procedure. Eliminate documentation before federal agencies can access it. They don't realize we've been copying everything since Caleb's network started gathering evidence." Through his mirrors, Caleb tracked the riders' reinforcements as they received new orders through their communications channels. Their professional formation was fragmenting as competing commands created confusion in their ranks. "They're losing tactical cohesion," he observed, his weathered hands steady on his tools. "Too many officers trying to control the situation. Too many conflicting priorities." "Multiple breach attempts detected on our secure networks," Cooper reported. "Professional cyber teams targeting our communication systems. But they're running into protocols that weren't designed by amateurs." Caleb allowed himself a small smile as he shaped glowing steel. His preparations hadn't just been physical. Years of special operations experience had taught him that modern warfare required digital defenses as strong as physical ones. "Let them chase electronic ghosts. Every attempt to breach our security reveals more about their own networks." Deputy Martinez's voice crackled through their encrypted channel. "State police cyber units are tracking the attacks. Each breach attempt is creating a digital trail straight back to their command structure. We're identifying key players we never knew existed." The Forge's heat painted everything in shades of tactical advantage as Caleb moved through his morning. Routine. Each action was calculated, each position measured, while his carefully prepared digital defenses turned the attacker's own techniques against them. "Your network wasn't just gathering evidence," Morrison realized, watching the coordination between local allies and federal agencies. "You were building a complete intelligence apparatus designed to activate the moment they tried to eliminate their tracks." "Information is like steel," Caleb replied, testing the edge of a newly forged blade. "Properly tempered, it becomes stronger under pressure. Every attempt to destroy it just reveals its true nature." Through their secure communications, they heard the mounting frustration of their opponents as each attempt to control the situation backfired. Professional cyber teams found themselves entangled in defensive protocols that had been designed by special operations veterans. Criminal networks discovered their own secure channels compromised by counterintelligence experts. "They're shifting tactics," Sarah reported, "trying to flood local media with disinformation, stories about business disputes, criminal allegations against property owners, anything to discredit our evidence." "Let them." Caleb's voice carried the quiet confidence of a strategist who had already mapped every possible response. Every false story they plant becomes another piece of evidence showing coordinated deception. Sometimes the best way to expose a lie is to let them tell too many at once. Morrison watched the digital battle unfold across multiple screens, his expression showing growing appreciation for the complexity of Caleb's preparation. "You didn't just build a defensive network. You created an intelligence trap. Every countermeasure they employ exposes more of their operation." Through his windows, Caleb tracked the increasing desperation in their opponents' movements. Professional discipline was cracking as they realized their sophisticated digital warfare capabilities were being turned against them. Each attempt to regain control only strengthened the evidence being gathered by federal agencies. "They're running out of options," Cooper observed through the secure channel. "Can't eliminate the evidence, can't discredit the sources, can't shut down our communications. What's their next move?" "They'll revert to direct action," Caleb predicted, his hands never pausing in their work. When sophisticated methods fail, most operators fall back on brute force. It's predictable, which makes it manageable. Because their opponents had made another crucial miscalculation, they thought their superior technology and professional cyber warfare capabilities would allow them to eliminate evidence of their operations. Instead, they had walked into a carefully prepared digital battleground designed by someone who understood that modern warfare isn't just fought with weapons, but with information turned into intelligence by the steady hands of a warrior who had spent his life learning that the most effective battles are won before the enemy realizes they've been outmaneuvered on every front. The attack came through official channels at precisely 9 a.m. when government offices opened their doors. A flood of legal notices, regulatory inspections, and administrative reviews descended upon the valley with the calculated precision of a military operation. Through his forge windows, Caleb watched suited officials replace motorcycle riders, bureaucratic warfare superseding direct confrontation. The transition from physical to administrative assault was seamless, revealing the sophisticated planning behind their opponent's strategy. Health Department just posted an emergency closure notice, Deputy Martinez reported through their secure channel, her voice tight with controlled tension. Citing unsafe conditions and environmental hazards, they've got a team outside Cooper's store right now conducting an immediate safety inspection. 3 more teams heading toward the historical district. Caleb continued his work, each hammer strike measured and precise as he processed the tactical implications. The rhythm of metal on metal provided cover for his quiet communications with his network. Standard protocol, when direct action fails, use legitimate authority to eliminate resistance. How many agencies involved, and what's their deployment pattern? At least 6 different departments, Sarah's voice carried controlled tension. Building inspectors hitting the north side, environmental protection moving through the business, district, business licensing targeting storage facilities. Historical preservation review teams are documenting structural concerns at every property we've been protecting. They're moving in a coordinated sweep pattern, just like a military operation. Morrison watched from his position near the forge window as more official vehicles arrived, their government plates gleaming in the morning sun. Professional operation. They're using their political connections to mobilize every regulatory body. They can influence, trying to shut down your network through legal means. The coordination suggests central command, probably operating from a secure location outside the valley. Through his carefully positioned surveillance systems, Caleb tracked the deployment of bureaucratic forces across the valley. Their movements revealed military precision hidden behind civilian authority, systematic coverage of key points, overlapping jurisdictions, synchronized timing of inspections. Each team's position supported the others, creating a web of official pressure that would have crushed most opposition. "Marcus, status of supply lines?" Caleb asked, his weathered hands never pausing in their work at the forge. The heat from the fire cast dancing shadows across his collection of tools, each one positioned for both crafting and combat. "All deliveries suddenly facing regulatory holds," Marcus reported grimly. "Department of Transportation ordered immediate safety inspections of every truck entering the valley, EPA demanding environmental impact reviews for all shipments, USDA requiring special permits for food transport. They're trying to strangle us through paperwork. Even my smallest delivery routes are being hit with multiple inspection requirements." The forge's heat painted everything in shades of tactical opportunity as Caleb moved through his morning routine. Each action was calculated while his mind processed the evolving battlefield. The familiar scent of coal and hot steel mixed with the tension in the air, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation. They think bureaucratic warfare will be more effective than direct confrontation. Time to show them why that assumption is dangerous. Multiple business licenses suspended pending review, Cooper added through their encrypted channel, his voice steady despite the pressure. Bank accounts frozen for suspicious activity. Credit lines suddenly under audit. Insurance policies flagged for immediate review. They're trying to cut off our resources, isolate us through official channels. Even my most reliable suppliers are being pressured to cut ties. Caleb allowed himself a slight smile as he shaped glowing steel, the metal bending to his will, just as circumstances would soon bend to his planning. They forgot something important about official actions. Every order creates documentation. Every review leaves paper trails. Every inspection generates reports that can be analyzed for patterns of coordinated harassment. Their own bureaucratic weapons will become evidence against them. Morrison nodded with growing appreciation, watching Caleb's measured movements. You didn't just prepare for physical confrontation. You were ready for bureaucratic warfare too. Already had contingencies in place. This isn't your first time facing administrative assault. Sarah's Historical Society documentation provides legal coverage for continued operations, Caleb explained, his weathered hands steady on his tools as he worked the metal with precise force. Every property's historical status triggers mandatory review periods before any regulatory action can be enforced. Federal preservation laws require extensive documentation and justification for any changes to protected structures. Gives us time to document patterns of coordinated administrative abuse. Through their secure communications, they heard mounting frustration as each bureaucratic attack encountered carefully prepared legal defenses. Professional administrators found their actions being documented and analyzed by legal experts who understood patterns of coordinated harassment. Every attempt to shut down businesses or restrict operations met with precise, prepared responses that turned their own regulations against them. "They're escalating," Deputy Martinez reported, her voice carrying the tension of someone watching a coordinated assault unfold. Internal Revenue Service just initiated emergency audits on every business in our network. Occupational Safety and Health Administration demanding immediate compliance reviews with unreasonable deadlines. Even Fish and Wildlife Service claiming endangered species concerns in areas they've never shown interest before. The pressure is mounting across every possible channel. Let them come. Caleb's voice carried the quiet confidence of a strategist who had mapped every possible avenue of attack. Every official action becomes evidence. Every coordinated review reveals connections between legitimate authorities and criminal enterprises. Sometimes the best way to expose corruption is to let them demonstrate it themselves. Their own desperate tactics will prove our case for us. The Valley's response to bureaucratic warfare emerged with the same precision that Caleb had once brought to special operations missions. As morning light filled the forge with tactical clarity, the community's coordinated resistance revealed itself through carefully prepared channels. Through his mirrors, Caleb watched official vehicles move through the streets, their government, authority meeting an opposition they hadn't anticipated. Historical Society just filed emergency preservation orders, Sarah reported through their secure network, her voice carrying quiet triumph. Every property they're targeting is now protected under federal historical registration. Any administrative action requires formal review periods and public hearings. They can't touch a single building without documented justification. Caleb continued his work at the forge, each hammer strike marking time like a sniper counting heartbeats. Status of supporting documentation. Comprehensive, Sarah confirmed. 3 generations of architectural records, documented cultural significance, photographic evidence of every structural detail. We've been preparing these files since they first appeared in the valley. The Federal Historical Registry Office is already processing our emergency applications. Through his carefully positioned surveillance systems, Caleb tracked the mounting frustration among the officials attempting to enforce their coordinated shutdown. Their military precision faltered against unexpected legal barriers and community preparation. Local business association just activated our contingency protocols, Marcus added, his delivery routes now serving as intelligence-gathering channels. Every shop they're trying to close has filed for emergency injunctions. State Commerce Board is being flooded with evidence of coordinated harassment. The pattern is too obvious to ignore. Morrison watched from his position near the forge window as more community members emerged to document every official action. Your network isn't just resisting. They're turning bureaucratic warfare into evidence gathering. Every inspection, every citation, every administrative order becomes proof of organized harassment. Got movement at the county offices, Deputy Martinez reported through their encrypted channel. State oversight committees just received simultaneous complaints from 40 different businesses, all documenting the same patterns of coordinated administrative abuse. They can't dismiss this as routine enforcement anymore. Caleb allowed himself a small smile as he shaped glowing steel. Communities are like metal. Apply too much pressure, and they don't just break, they forge themselves into something stronger. Every attempt to crush resistance creates more evidence of corruption. Through the forge's windows, he watched Tommy leading a group of students from the local history club. Each carried cameras and notepads, carefully documenting every official vehicle, every inspection team, every administrative action. The young observers moved with the awareness Caleb had taught them, gathering intelligence while appearing to conduct routine historical documentation. School board just rejected their emergency safety inspection, Cooper reported with quiet satisfaction. Turns out, our student environmental club has been maintaining detailed safety records all year. Every inspection, every maintenance check, all properly documented and filed. They've got no grounds for emergency action. The forge's heat painted everything in shades of tactical advantage as Caleb continued his work. Each precise movement masked his coordination of a community-wide response that transformed bureaucratic assault into documented evidence of corruption. They're pulling back from the historical district, Sarah observed through their secure channel. Federal preservation officers are demanding explanations for the coordinated targeting of protected properties. Every attempt to justify their actions just exposes more connections between official agencies and criminal enterprises. Morrison nodded with professional appreciation. You didn't just prepare the community for resistance. You positioned them to transform administrative warfare into intelligence gathering. Every official action becomes evidence. Every coordinated attack reveals more of their network. Local media's starting to ask questions, Martinez added. Too many simultaneous inspections, too many coordinated administrative actions. The pattern's becoming obvious even to casual observers. We're getting calls from state-level investigative reporters. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb watched their opponent's frustration mounting as each bureaucratic thrust encountered prepared resistance. Their military precision crumbled against a community united in turning administrative warfare into documented evidence. Chamber of Commerce just released an official statement, Marcus reported, demanding state-level investigation into coordinated targeting of local businesses. They're using our documented pattern of harassment to force oversight committees into action. Sometimes the best defense isn't just resistance, Caleb observed, his weathered hands steady on tools that forged both metal and victory. It's turning an opponent's weapons against them. Every administrative action they take strengthens our case. Every coordinated attack reveals more of their organization, because their opponents had made another crucial miscalculation in their strategic planning. They thought bureaucratic warfare would isolate and overwhelm individual businesses. Instead, they encountered a united community prepared to transform administrative assault into documented evidence of corruption. Their own actions became weapons against them, guided by the steady hands of a warrior who understood that modern victories often come not through direct confrontation, but through the patient precision of turning an opponent's strength into their fatal weakness. The final confrontation ignited at dawn, when morning mist still clung to the valley floor like smoke from distant battlefields. Through his forge windows, Caleb watched their opponents commit to their last, desperate gambit. Private military contractors moved in tactical formation, their vehicles replacing the government officials who had failed to shut down the community through bureaucratic means. Behind them, the remaining riders provided support, their motorcycles, maintaining coverage of secondary routes. Multiple teams approaching from all directions, Deputy Martinez reported through their secure channel, her voice carrying professional calm. Former special operations, private security contractors, some I recognize from international hot zones. They're running this like a military operation now. No more pretense of legitimate authority. Morrison tracked the incoming forces through satellite feeds, his expression grim. Counting 12 tactical teams, advanced equipment, professional coordination. They're burning their cover completely, committing everything they have to eliminate the evidence we've gathered. Caleb continued working at his forge, each hammer strike precise and measured as he monitored the approaching forces through his carefully positioned surveillance network. Status of our preparations? All in position, Cooper confirmed. Every approach covered, every line of sight documented. Sarah's teams have cameras on every tactical unit. State police are moving into blocking positions outside the valley, federal response teams standing by. Everything they do now becomes evidence. Through his mirrors, Caleb watched the private contractors establish their assault positions. Their deployment was textbook perfect, demonstrating the kind of tactical precision that would have impressed him in another life. Now, it simply confirmed the desperation driving their final push. They're targeting key positions first, Martinez observed. Cooper's store, the Historical Society archives, our secure communications hub, trying to eliminate our documentation capabilities before moving on the forge. Caleb allowed himself a slight smile as he shaped glowing steel. Let them think they understand the battlefield. Sometimes the best position isn't the most obvious. 1. The contractors' advance stalled as they encountered the first layer of Caleb's preparations. Every approach they tried revealed new complications. Carefully positioned equipment creating unexpected obstacles, pre-planned community activities blocking tactical routes, documented civilian presence requiring careful consideration. They're frustrated, Morrison noted, watching through secure feeds, expected to find isolated targets. Instead, they're facing coordinated resistance. Every aggressive action they take creates more evidence against them. Digging through their encrypted channel, Sarah's voice carried quiet satisfaction. Got their command vehicle isolated on camera. Every order they transmit, every tactical movement they coordinate, all being documented from multiple angles. Federal agencies are receiving live feeds. The forge's heat painted everything in shades of tactical advantage as Caleb continued his work. Each precise movement masked his coordination of a defensive network that transformed military assault into documented evidence of criminal conspiracy. They're splitting their forces, Cooper reported. 6 teams moving to secure secondary targets, 6 maintaining pressure on primary objectives. Standard tactical dispersion, but it's thinning their coverage. Exactly as expected, Caleb responded. his weathered hands steady on tools that had prepared for this moment. When pressure builds, trained operators follow predictable patterns, makes their movements easier to anticipate, easier to document. The contractor's frustration mounted as each tactical thrust encountered prepared resistance. Their military precision began to crack against a battlefield that had been prepared by someone who understood their methods intimately. Every aggressive action they took simply created more evidence of their illegal operation. Federal response. Teams moving into position, Morrison confirmed. State police establishing outer containment. They've got everything they need to move, just waiting for the contractors to commit fully to their assault. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb watched the final pieces move into place. The contractors, driven by desperation and deadlines, prepared for their decisive push. Their tactical formation was perfect, their equipment professional, their coordination exact. They thought they were executing a precision military operation. Instead, they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. Remember, Caleb's voice carried quiet authority through their secure network. Let them commit to their assault. Every action they take, every tactic they employ, becomes evidence of organized criminal activity. Sometimes the best way to defeat an opponent is to let them defeat themselves. The morning sun broke through the valley's mist, revealing the full scope of the confrontation. Private military contractors, their cover completely abandoned, prepared to eliminate a threat through direct action. They brought overwhelming force, professional expertise, and tactical precision to their assault. But they had made one final, critical miscalculation in their strategic planning. They thought they were attacking a simple network of local resistance. Instead, they had walked into a carefully prepared battlefield, designed by someone who understood that the most effective weapon isn't force or firepower, but the patient precision of turning an opponent's own tactics into evidence of their crimes. And as federal response teams moved into position, as state police established containment, as documented evidence streamed to multiple agencies, the contractors were about to learn why some battles are lost the moment you choose the wrong ground to fight on. The valley echoed with the sound of rotors as federal helicopters arrived in the aftermath of the confrontation. Through his forge windows, Caleb watched tactical teams processing the private contractors who had so confidently arrived just hours before. Their professional equipment and tactical gear seemed out of place now, stripped of the authority that confidence had lent them. Final numbers coming in, Morrison reported, reviewing updates on his secure tablet. 38 contractors in custody, including their entire command structure. Another 24 riders who chose to stay with them. The rest surrendered when they realized they were being sacrificed as disposable assets. Caleb continued his work at the forge, each hammer strike marking time as he processed the tactical implications of their victory. The familiar rhythm provided counterpoint to the organized chaos outside, as federal agents documented every piece of evidence, every weapon, every piece of tactical gear that proved the scale of the criminal operation. Sarah's teams have transferred all documentation to federal custody, Deputy Martinez added through their secure channel. Over 1,000 hours of video evidence, detailed records of every coordinated action, proof of connections between criminal enterprises and legitimate authorities. They're calling it one of the most comprehensive intelligence operations they've seen. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Caleb tracked the movement of evidence collection teams across the valley. Their methodical progress revealed the full scope of what his network had accomplished, not just defeating a tactical assault, but exposing an entire criminal infrastructure. State police just finished securing the outer perimeter, Cooper reported, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. Found 3 more cache sites these contractors had prepared for their operation. Weapons, communications equipment, evidence of long-term planning, everything documented and logged. Morrison moved to the forge window, watching federal teams process the scene with professional efficiency. You didn't just stop their assault. You turned their entire operation into evidence. Every tactical decision they made, every piece of equipment they brought, every communication they sent, all of it documented and verified by multiple sources. The forge's heat painted everything in shades of victory as Caleb shaped another piece of steel. Each precise movement masked his continued vigilance, years of combat experience telling him that aftermath could be as dangerous as confrontation. Getting interesting reports from other regions, Marcus added through their encrypted channel, similar operations falling apart across 3 states. Once these contractors went down, their whole network started unraveling. Nobody wants to be the last one holding evidence when federal investigators arrive. Caleb allowed himself a small smile as he worked the metal. Professional operators understand tactical momentum. When a position becomes untenable, those with experience know when to cut losses. The rest learn the hard way. Tommy appeared in the forge doorway, his young face showing the mixture of excitement and solemn understanding that came from watching history unfold. Mr. Harrison, the federal agents want to know if they can document your defense preparations. They say they've never seen anything like it. Of course they haven't, Morrison commented, watching Caleb's steady work at the forge. Most people prepare for direct confrontation. You prepared for documentation, turned their own tactical expertise into evidence against them. Every position they took, every movement they made, just strengthened the case. Through their secure communications, they heard updates continuing to flow as federal teams processed the scene. Each piece of equipment, each tactical plan, each communication log revealed more connections between criminal enterprises and seemingly legitimate operations. Local media's arriving, Martinez reported, along with federal press officers. They're calling it a major breakthrough in organized crime investigation. Your forge is about to become famous for more than just metalwork. Caleb tested the edge of his newly forged blade, its keen surface reflecting the organized activity outside. Fame's not important, justice is. Sometimes the best way to serve justice is to let others think they're in control, while you document their every move. Sarah's voice joined their channel. Just got word from federal prosecutors. They're amazed at the quality of our evidence. Said we've given them everything they need to dismantle similar operations across multiple states. Your preparation made the difference. Because their opponents had made one final crucial error in their calculations. They thought bringing overwhelming force would allow them to eliminate evidence of their operation. Instead, they had walked into a carefully prepared documentation zone designed by someone who understood that modern victories aren't just won through force, but through the patient precision of turning an opponent's every action into proof of their crimes. What happens now? Tommy asked, watching federal agents photograph and document every aspect of the forge's defensive preparations. Now, Caleb replied, his weathered hands steady on his tools, we go back to our real work, but we stay ready. Stay vigilant, because somewhere, someone else is watching this valley, learning lessons from what happened here. And when they come, we'll be prepared to teach them the same truth these contractors learned today. Morrison nodded in understanding, that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most weapons or the best tactics. It's the one who knows how to turn your own strength into evidence against you. Through his forge windows, Caleb watched the sun climbing higher over the valley, painting everything in shades of hard-won victory. The contractors had brought tactical precision, professional equipment, and overwhelming force to their assault. But they had never understood that they weren't just fighting a defensive network. They were walking into a carefully prepared lesson about how modern battles are won not just through force of arms, but through the patient precision of turning every aggressive action into documented proof of justice's necessity. The ripple effects of the valley's victory spread like waves from a precision strike. 2 months after the confrontation, Caleb's Forge had become more than just a workplace. It was a symbol of how communities could resist organized crime through strategic documentation. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, he watched another group of federal agents arrive, these ones bringing updates rather than tactical gear. Final numbers from the investigation are staggering, Morrison reported, spreading documents across Caleb's workbench. 17 similar operations dismantled across 8 states, over 200 arrests, including corrupt officials and law enforcement. Your documentation provided the template for every subsequent investigation. Caleb continued his work at the Forge, each hammer strike precise and measured as he processed the broader implications. The familiar rhythm of metal on metal provided counterpoint to Morrison's briefing about systemic changes spreading across the country. State police academies are implementing new training protocols, Deputy Martinez added through their secure channel, her voice carrying professional satisfaction. Using your network's methods as a case study in community-based intelligence gathering, they're calling it the Harrison Doctrine, strategic documentation over direct confrontation. Through his windows, Caleb watched Tommy leading another group of students through the historical district. The boys' awareness training had evolved into a formal program, teaching young people how to observe and document suspicious patterns while maintaining their safety. Got word from law enforcement contacts in 3 more states, Cooper reported, his hunting store now a recognized center for community safety training. They're establishing similar documentation networks in their regions, local businesses coordinating with historical societies, creating legitimate coverage for surveillance operations. Sarah's voice joined their encrypted channel. Historical preservation societies across the country are revising their protocols, using our methods to protect not just buildings, but communities. Federal agencies are actually encouraging it, gives them clean, documented evidence of criminal enterprises. The Forge's heat painted everything in shades of tactical victory as Caleb shaped another piece of steel. Each precise movement masked his continued vigilance, years of combat experience telling him that success often brought new challenges. Criminal organizations are adapting, Marcus noted, his delivery routes now part of a nationwide intelligence network, trying to find ways around documentation protocols. But that just makes their patterns more obvious, easier to track. Every attempt to evade observation creates new evidence. Morrison watched Caleb's steady work with professional appreciation. You didn't just stop one operation. You created a new model for community defense. Federal agencies are restructuring their approach to organized crime based on your methods. Through their secure communications, they heard updates about similar transformations spreading across the country. Communities that had once felt helpless against criminal enterprises were learning to turn documentation into their strongest weapon. Local journalism schools are adding courses, Martinez reported, teaching students how to safely document suspicious patterns, coordinate with law enforcement, protect themselves while gathering evidence. Your Forge has become a case study in civilian counterintelligence. Caleb tested the edge of his newly forged blade, its keen surface reflecting the transformed valley outside. Knowledge spreads like fire. Once people understand they can resist through documentation, no amount of criminal pressure can make them forget that power. Tommy entered the Forge, carrying his latest project, a detailed map of community observation points disguised as a historical survey. Mr. Harrison, we've got visitors from another state's historical society. They want to learn about our documentation methods. Your training program's becoming famous, Morrison observed. Law enforcement agencies are particularly interested in how you taught awareness without creating unnecessary risks. professional observers impressed by your methods. Because their victory had revealed something crucial about modern conflict. The contractors had brought tactical precision and overwhelming force, but they'd been defeated by something more powerful, the patient documentation of their own actions, turned into evidence by a community that understood the true nature of modern defense. Getting reports from across the country, Sarah added. Criminal organizations trying to expand their territories are finding every move documented, every pattern recorded. Some are actually withdrawing from regions where communities have implemented your methods. Caleb allowed himself a small smile as he worked the metal. Professional operators understand strategic shifts. When every action creates evidence against you, traditional intimidation tactics become counterproductive. They'll adapt or fail. Through his carefully positioned surveillance system, he watched more visitors arrive at the forge. Law enforcement, officials, community leaders, historians, all coming to learn how a small valley had transformed documentation into their strongest defense against organized crime. Federal agencies are officially adopting your protocols, Morrison confirmed, making community documentation a central part of their strategy against criminal enterprises. Your forge isn't just a symbol anymore, it's becoming the template for a nationwide transformation in how we fight organized crime. Because that was the real victory. Not just defeating one criminal operation, but showing communities everywhere that their strongest weapon wasn't force or fear, but the patient precision of documented truth. And as Caleb watched his methods spread across the country, he knew that somewhere criminal enterprises were learning a crucial lesson. In the modern world, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most weapons, but the one who knows how to turn your every action into evidence of your own defeat. 6 months after the confrontation, Caleb's forge remained a symbol of transformation, but not just for its role in defeating organized crime. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, he watched another kind of change unfolding, one that went beyond tactical victory to reshape the very nature of community defense. The morning light caught his tools, each one representing both ancient craft and modern strategy, a bridge between traditional skills and new methods of protection. Latest reports show permanent changes in criminal patterns, Morrison announced, reviewing updates on his secure tablet. Organizations that once used intimidation and force are finding their traditional methods obsolete. Every attempt at expansion creates documented evidence. Some are actually legitimate now, realizing it's their only sustainable option. Caleb continued his work at the forge, each hammer strike precise and measured as he processed the broader implications. The familiar rhythm of metal on metal provided counterpoint to the sounds of a valley transformed not just by victory, but by lasting vigilance. Training programs have evolved, Tommy reported proudly, now leading his own youth observation classes. We're teaching the next generation not just how to watch, but how to protect themselves and their communities through strategic documentation. Every student learns both craft and awareness. Through his windows, Caleb watched more visitors arrive, community leaders, law enforcement officials, even former criminals seeking to understand the new paradigm. His forge had become more than a workplace or even a symbol. It was now a center for learning how modern communities could defend themselves through patience and precision rather than force. Got word from international contacts, Deputy Martinez added through their secure channel. Similar methods being adopted in communities across borders. Your documentation protocols are being translated into multiple languages, adapted for different cultural contexts. Sarah's voice carried quiet satisfaction. Historical societies worldwide are implementing variations of our program, preserving not just buildings and artifacts, but community safety through strategic observation. Every region adapts the methods to their specific needs while maintaining the core principles. The forge's heat painted everything in shades of lasting change as Caleb shaped another piece of steel. Each precise movement demonstrated the integration of traditional craft with modern strategy, showing visitors how ancient skills could inform new methods of protection. Criminal enterprises are facing a new reality, Cooper observed from his position near the window. When communities know how to document patterns and coordinate resistance, traditional intimidation becomes self-defeating. Every aggressive action just creates more evidence. Morrison watched Caleb's steady work with renewed appreciation. You didn't just create a defensive strategy. You started a revolution in how communities protect themselves. Federal agencies are now supporting local documentation networks, recognizing them as their most valuable intelligence assets. Through their secure communications, they heard updates about continuing transformations. Communities that had once lived in fear were now centers of coordinated observation, turning criminal pressure into documented evidence of organized activity. Education systems are changing too, Marcus reported. Schools incorporating awareness, training into regular curricula, teaching students how to recognize patterns, document concerns safely, contribute to community protection. Your methods are becoming part of basic civic education. Tommy entered with his latest project, a training manual disguised as a historical document, teaching other young people how to balance awareness with safety. The student network is growing, Mr. Harrison. Every month brings requests from new schools wanting to implement similar programs. Because you taught us something crucial, the boy continued, his young face showing wisdom beyond his years. True strength isn't in weapons or force, but in the patient precision of documented truth. That's a lesson that transcends generations. Caleb allowed himself a rare smile as he worked the metal. Every skill worth learning carries deeper lessons. Blacksmithing teaches patience, precision, the importance of preparation. Those same principles apply to protecting what matters, whether it's crafting metal or safeguarding communities. Through his carefully positioned surveillance system, he watched the valley thriving under its new paradigm. Businesses operated freely, community events flourished, and young people learned to balance awareness with optimism. The shadow of criminal intimidation had been replaced by the strength of coordinated vigilance. Your forge has become more than a symbol, Morrison observed. It's a living lesson in how communities can transform themselves. Every visitor learns not just about resistance, but about sustainable protection through strategic documentation. Because that was the true legacy of their victory, not just defeating one criminal operation, but showing the world a new way to protect what matters. The contractors had brought tactical precision and overwhelming force, but they'd been defeated by something more powerful. The patient documentation of their own actions turned into evidence by a community that understood the true nature of modern defense. The world really has changed, Deputy Martinez noted, watching another group of visitors arrive to learn from their experience. Criminal enterprises can't operate in the shadows anymore, not when communities know how to shine light on every pattern of suspicious activity. Caleb set down his hammer, studying the piece he'd just completed, a decorative gate hinge that would serve both beauty and security. Change is like forging metal, he observed. Apply the right pressure at the right moment, and you can reshape reality itself. But the real art is in making that change last, making it stronger than what came before. Because that was the final lesson the Valley had taught the world. The true victory isn't just in winning one battle, but in transforming how future battles are fought. And as Caleb watched the sun set over his forge, he knew that somewhere, The next generation was learning the most important truth of all. In the modern world, the strongest weapon isn't force or fear, but the patient precision of communities united in turning every act of aggression into evidence of justice's necessity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.